In the early to mid-1800s, smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, and scarlet fever epidemics scourged and terrorized much of the world. In the United States, small towns in the Midwest were more severely affected than the largest cities. Reporting of deaths for a given year does not reflect the real terror created in these towns. Most deaths occurred in a few days or weeks, so the effect was magnified. In some cases, the early death rate, extrapolated for a year, would have exceeded the local population. Midwestern epidemics and its effects can scarcely be found in the memories of the people now living in the towns that were affected. It has been generally lost from local histories or reduced to short or vague paragraphs, except in a few places with a well-developed sense of the past. One such town, St. Charles, near St. Louis, Missouri, was ravaged by yellow fever in 1853. Yellow fever is caused by a virus transmitted by mosquitoes and ticks. The virus can lead to death in up to 50% of those who contract the horrible disease. Jaundice, fatigue, heart arrhythmia, seizures, and internal bleeding are some of the horrific symptoms associated with the disease. The name yellow fever, deriving from the ghastly appearance of those racked with jaundice from the disease, giving their skin a deathly yellow hue. Though the source of the disease in St. Charles has always been explained as simply coming from infected mosquito bites, the truth may be far more disturbing. An almost completely forgotten folk tale dating back to 1852 describes an English family who emigrated to St. Charles by the name of Porter. The father, whose name was Thomas Porter, his wife Elizabeth, and young daughter Mary. Mary was 10 years old when the family had moved from Dover, southeast England, to St. Charles. They purchased a modest home on the outskirts of St. Charles. Thomas, who was an educator, quickly acquired a position at the local schoolhouse. Elizabeth was a pianist and spent most of her time at the local church. After a few months, the family had settled in at St. Charles and now regarded the quaint town as home. One afternoon, Elizabeth was notified that Mary was quite ill and required transport from the school. Upon arriving at the school, Elizabeth was shocked to discover young Mary in a terrible state. She was sweating profusely and speaking incoherently. One of the teachers helped secure a carriage to transport Elizabeth and the stricken young Mary home. Over the next few days, Mary's condition rapidly deteriorated. She became yellow with jaundice, and her fever only worsened. She was severely dehydrated and profusely vomiting. Within 24 hours, young Mary was deceased. The doctor, as well as the townspeople, believed she had liver disease, which ultimately led to her demise. No one at this point had contracted yellow fever in the surrounding cities, and thus was not known, nor was it a consideration for the cause of young Mary's death. Mary's parents were utterly devastated, but her father was beyond consoling. He fell into a deep depression and withdrew from everyone. By the next day, however, he seemed energized and began imploring Elizabeth that he had found the perfect coffin for his daughter, a Fisk casket, from the neighboring St. Louis. A Fisk casket was a pricey iron casket usually reserved for the wealthy that was designed to be airtight and claimed to be able to preserve the interred and keep them appearing lifelike far longer than a typical casket. Thomas pressed further, stating no cemetery was suitable for his daughter's burial. They would bury her on their homestead. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed. It would take just 2 days from the time young Mary died before the Fisk coffin was acquired and she was interred atop a small hill near a tree she had loved to climb. Those in attendance were only her mother and father at the insistence of her father. The grief-stricken family would scarcely have time to mourn before a torrential rainstorm engulfed the town. For 3 days, rains fell without ceasing, and many homes and farmlands were completely inundated. Among them was the porter's land. While flooding of the home was minor, the land itself had become a massive swamp. Several days after the storm had ceased, a passerby noticed the hilltop had collapsed, having been dislodged by the tremendous amount of rain. He notified Thomas of what he had seen, and the two of them traveled the still very muddy fields to survey the hilltop. When they arrived, they both stood still, shocked in horror. The collapse had unearthed the Fisk coffin and shattered the glass window that sealed the casket, making it airtight. The decomposing corpse of Thomas's daughter was clearly visible, being only partially submerged in the now stagnant water from the mudslide. Flies and mosquitoes by the hundreds covered the casket, corpse, and surrounding area. Within 3 months of the accidental exhumation, the town was struck by a devastating epidemic of yellow fever. In the coming years, nearly half of the original population of St. Charles would succumb and perish to the deadly disease. Perhaps ironically, in later years the Fisk casket's airtight design were known to be used by states to inter those who perished by contractable diseases in order to prevent transmission of the diseases from the corpses while in transit aboard trains and carriages.